All right. Well, good. Hello, everyone. Let's start off with prayer. Father God, we thank you for your blessings and mercy and grace once again. We praise you for who you are and what you've given to us, Lord God. We just pray that this time would be an opportunity for us to glorify your name, to thank you for who you are, and to learn more about you, Lord. So we invite your Holy Spirit to be here with us, guide us and lead us in all truth, and help us to grow in our understanding of who you are through the study of these texts, Lord God. We give you thanks for it in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we are doing today a reshoot or refilming or restreaming at least of a class that got messed up by my technical problems of not being able to get the audio on. So if you're watching online, this is going to be our I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist class or our Essential Christian Apologetics class, session 5.2, and I call it 5.2 just so we don't get out of the stream of where I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist goes on. But here we are going to start taking a look at Mere Christianity. So this is C.S. Lewis's book. It's a important textbook or book that has been a part of C.S. Lewis's teaching and our understanding of Christian apologetics for about half a century or more. And so we're going to look at what he calls Book 1. Book 1 is where he's beginning to demonstrate his connection to our understanding of faith through looking at the moral law. The moral law is the essential. So I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, we know that we started with going back to the very beginning and looking at philosophical understandings of things. We've been looking at the various lines of argumentation like the cosmological argument, meaning that everything that has a beginning had a beginner, something that started it. We've looked at the teleological argument, saying everything that's designed has a designer. And then we looked at, in that book, we looked at the moral argument. It was called, I believe it's chapter 6, was called Hitler versus Mother Teresa, or Mother Teresa versus Hitler. And so that's where authors, Turek and Geisler, began to describe the existence of a true moral law that can only have a source outside of mankind. And so that's what we also see here with Mere Christianity in the study of Mere Christianity through C.S. Lewis. So let's jump in. So what we see in chapter 1 of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity is what he calls the law of human nature. Okay, might call it the moral law. Some people might have a different phrase of it, but it's really the law of human nature according to the language in the C.S. Lewis book. So he says this: by simple observation, we witness appeals to a moral law, to a moral standard, heard in everyday conversation by people of all walks of life in every age group and every education level. Things like this: how would you like it if someone did the same thing to you? Well, that's my seat. I was here first. Give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Come on, you promised. These statements are not an appeal to have someone yield to the speaker's personal preference, but rather are an appeal for the other person to observe a real standard that both people already know about. Seldom do we ever hear a response from the other party saying, well, to hell with your standards, because that's not their argument for why they're doing what they're doing. It's not a problem with the standards. They want you to understand or apply a different standard in their circumstance. So we see this other objecting party, someone who may have done something morally objectionable, typically responds with a reason why a already agreed upon standard by all of humanity should not apply to him in this specific situation. He might say something like, if you only knew what kind of day I had. Or something like, how about possession is 9/10 of the law? And it's funny because I've never ever heard anyone say, well, possession is 9/10 of the law when they hadn't stolen something or taken something that belonged to somebody else. I've never ever heard somebody who legitimately owned something say, well, possession is 9/10 of the law, therefore, obviously, I have 90% of what I own. It's always an attempt to offer an excuse rather than obeying and submitting to a well-known standard of human behavior. So in nearly all cases, both parties seem to acknowledge the existence of a real moral standard. One person wants the other party to conform to the standard, and the other party wants the first person to offer a forgiveness of reason or a reason why they don't have to apply that standard to them in this place. So the debate is really over how to properly apply the standard because it's already known and both parties disagree on application rather than the existence of a true standard. So we see quarreling between these two positions occurs because one party appeals to the other party's obligation to the same moral standard, which both parties genuinely believe exists, and at least one of the two parties believes should be observed in this situation. So C.S. Lewis gives us the explanation here. Just as all bodies are governed by physical laws, such as, let's say, gravity, which nothing and no one can truly disobey, not a rock and not a human being, we can't just ignore the existence of gravity. We find the same human beings are also governed by a real moral law, even if most people choose to disobey it. Say that again. Like gravity, we find in human beings the existence of a real moral law, and most people understand it, even if they know they're disobeying it. They have a choice, but it doesn't mean their choice invalidates the existence of the moral standard. So differences in understanding or application are typically minor and do not disprove the existence of a moral law. We'll find in the text, as we read through or go through the work of C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, we'll find a number of examples where people try to claim, well, that means the moral law doesn't exist because there's different applications or there's different abilities or observed looking at different standards. People will try to say, no, well, there's a different moral objective standard, and that's what we'll not see. We'll see examples of how we see applicational differences, but not existence of a true standard difference. For example, here's a number of them. Is there any culture in any time period of ancient history or today where a soldier running away in battle and leaving others behind to fight in his place is considered honorable? If there's no moral standard, then why would we say that running away in battle to leave others to die or to be wounded or injured while you run to be safe rather than fight the battle is somehow honorable? We would say, no, it's dishonorable. All militaries, all societies would, generally speaking, consider this to be an immoral act, running away to leave others to fight for you. Another example might be, is there a cultural difference that celebrates a man who regularly cheats and injures the very people who were kindest to him? Do we ever see that kind of culture? Anything celebrated in ancient history all the way through to today where people are kind to someone and they're proud or happy to have that person then cheat and injure them in some way? Of course not. This is patently silly, and yet it's also a testimony towards a real moral standard that we see operating in the human culture. Another one is there any culture where selfishness, I want what I want, is admired and even encouraged by others? No, I mean, we typically see, sure, I'm selfish, but I don't want anybody else to be selfish because if everybody else is selfish, then I can't get what I want. Right? So we see selfishness is not admired and it's not encouraged by functional and healthy societies that we live in. A person or a nation may claim that honoring agreements is not a moral requirement that they are necessarily required to observe. But they nearly always, we find, demand that you honor your agreement to them, even if they would prefer to break their agreement to you. We see this double standard. Like in most cases, this is true of almost every aspect of the moral law, we see people want to hold other people to an objective standard because that's how they want to be treated. But then when they have a preference or something that serves their purposes, they want others to ignore the moral standard so that they can break it. But both occasions testify to a true, real, existing moral standard. Just as some people sometimes get the answer in mathematics or arithmetic incorrect, the fact that people, oftentimes many or all people, misapply the moral law in and of itself does not disprove the existence of the moral law. In fact, it really refines and shows us that while you can get mathematics wrong, you can get the moral law wrong, but mathematics doesn't change its objective truth any more than the moral standard changes its objective moral truth when someone misapplies it. The true and correct answer does not change in either case. 2 plus 2 is 4, and anything other than 2 plus 2 equals 4 is wrong. And the same standard, stealing from somebody is wrong. It doesn't matter if you got the wrong answer or did the wrong action. Stealing is wrong. 2 plus 2 equals something other than 4 is also wrong. And what we also find in so many cases is that people make excuses for their bad behavior, but rarely discard moral standards altogether, especially when they want others to obey the moral standard to their own benefit. So making excuses is in of itself a testimony to the existence of a true moral law. We don't make excuses for things that we don't believe we've violated. If we show up to work on time, we don't apologize for showing up to work on time. If we didn't steal somebody's wallet sitting on the chair, we don't apologize for not taking the opportunity to steal their wallet. We apologize if we've done something wrong, and we know we need to apologize because we have violated a true moral standard. So, we find again, no human offers excuses for complying with standards. So the conclusion, that's essentially a summary of C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, Chapter 1. What we find in conclusion here is that first, human beings all over the earth, for all of recorded history, have a curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way. And they really can't get rid of this idea. Second, human beings do not, in fact, behave the way that we ought to and know that we should behave. We know that we have broken an objective moral standard. So let me summarize that again, or just state that again. We see all over the world that people know and observe and testify to the existence of a true moral standard. We can't get rid of it. Second, virtually no human being, or essentially all but Christ, human beings on this planet who have ever lived have not truly obeyed the moral standard that we know exists. So then Lewis then transitions into the second chapter where he answers or anticipates objections that he has heard from the proclamation that he's made, I'm sure, dozens and dozens of times during his career, was that there are objections to this existence of a true moral standard. And the first one comes in the area of a law that operates within all human beings versus an instinct. So we need to make a distinction because there is a difference between having an instinctual impulse and a feeling that it would be right, good, or moral to take some action, whether that is consistent with the impulse or whether it goes exactly contrary to the nature of the impulse. Okay. So what we actually find in our human existence, we can search within ourselves and we can see it within others, is that we have competing instincts. So when instincts compete or contradict one with another, we need something else, something higher to determine at which of these actions or impulses or instincts we ought to take. Not which one do we want to take, but which one we ought to take. And so Lewis uses what he phrases as a herd instinct. That herd instinct can activate when a cry for help is heard. So if you're walking down a street in the middle of the night and you hear a cry, somebody screaming out in help, you don't know what's going on. Maybe there's some kind of a violent assault. Maybe they're being robbed. Maybe somebody is threatening to kill them. We don't know, but we hear some cry. A herd instinct in all of humanity is, I ought to go and help a person who's in danger. However, virtually all human beings would also have an instinct for self-preservation. This self-preservation instinct would activate when you hear this cry for help, and it would say, you don't want to go down that dark alley. You don't want to get yourself involved. What if what's happening to the victim happens to me? And so my self-preservation instinct kicks in and says, don't go help. Well, now I've got these two competing instincts. One says I should go help someone in need. Another one says, don't go help because you could run the risk of being in danger. How do I make a decision? How does any human being make a decision between these two competing instincts? We need something higher than either of those instincts to tell us the one we ought to suppress, not helping, and the one we ought to encourage in order to help the person. So we suppress the self-preservation and we morally go help someone who's in need. The moral directive, the ought to do instinct is, or not instinct, that statement that within my own conscience that says, I need to do something to help rather than to do self-preservation. What that is a testament to the existence of a true moral law. So these opposing instincts have that objective arbiter that judge between the two to determine which one we ought to follow. And here we find the solution does, in fact, show itself in the true moral law. Even if we fail to obey it, helping the person calling out for your assistance is what we ought to do, and running away and taking care of ourselves first rather than helping someone else's is what we ought not to do. Now, we can't use what somebody actually does to judge whether or not the moral law exists. If someone runs away, we say that they have not done what the moral law tells them they ought to do. And if they go and help, we see compliance with the moral law, even though they obviously would have had an instinct to have self-preservation. So the moral law in C.S. Lewis's discussion of this topic is compared to a sheet of music that instructs a musician on which notes he ought to play on a piano. Okay. So what we find, let's say an 88-key piano like we would have on our stage here, we find that not any one of those keys is inherently wrong or inherently correct. And that relates to our instincts. So we have this flood of instincts that may approach every decision that we make. And just like a key on a piano is right at some part in a musical performance and wrong at a different part, the same way we have all these instincts at play, at work in our own mind, our own conscience, and we need something other than the keys, other than the instincts, to tell us which is right. In the case of a keyboard and a pianist, it's a sheet of music that shows the timing and the rhythm and the keys and all that goes into that musical piece, which is right, which is wrong. And we as humans have a moral law embedded in our hearts, known to our consciences, that tells us which one is right and which one is wrong to follow in any circumstance. Therefore, the moral law cannot be merely an instinct because it sets higher than and gives instructions to us as to which instincts to follow at any given time. As I said, we need to recognize that no instinct in and of itself is either good or bad. Every one of them has a purpose, and we need to follow them in some circumstances and disobey them or suppress them in other circumstances, all according to something higher than ourselves, which is the moral standard that we're called to obey. So often these human instincts require encouragement. So I need to encourage a weaker moral instinct or an instinct that needs to take a moral encouragement. I need to encourage the one to go help someone in need, and I need to suppress the one that is telling me to run away and preserve my own life or my own safety. Alternatively, at certain times, human, as we said, must suppress these things. Because if we set up one instinct to be the number one instinct that rules over everything else, that in and of itself would result in some level of immorality within society. Even things like love or patriotism. We can't set up love as being the only thing that we will follow instinctively, or patriotism, love for country. And the same thing is true. A fighting instinct. I need to fight, or I need to fleet, a fight or flight kind of instinct there. And sex is another one he lists. Let's not be prude about it. Sex has a purpose. And if we always suppress it, well, then the world ceases to exist because there's no repopulation of the world. And yet we recognize throughout most of our existence as human beings, we need to suppress the sexual instinct and not give in to every impulse that we have. So there's always tension between any one of these instincts, and the only way to know which one to follow and which one to suppress in any given circumstance is to let the moral law tell us which one to follow. So the moral law is like an orchestral conductor that promotes or represses instincts so that they're only followed when it is good, proper, and moral to do so. C.S. Lewis again says the most dangerous thing we can do is to set up one impulse that we follow at all costs. For example, an overemphasis on the love of humanity may lead to people breaking agreements. Well, I don't want to see that person hurt by honoring their agreement, so that would be unloving, and so we're going to break agreements. Even going so far as to fake evidence at trial. Because I love that person so much, they robbed a bank, they committed murder, they raped someone, whatever it is. We're going to fake evidence so that they don't go to jail because it seems more loving not to send them to jail than to send them to jail. But then ultimately setting up love so that we no longer have justice, we are no longer concerned with right and wrong, postulated by Lewis, says it results in cruelty and treachery somehow in the name of love. And so we have to make a distinction between when is it right to be loving and when is it right to make sure that we are honest and truthful and seeking justice in the societies in which we live. So back to multiplication. The multiplication table is true whether a person is taught it or not. So this is an objection that says, well, wait a minute, only people who have culturally influenced believe in the moral law. Influenced by their Christianity, influenced by their Judaism, influenced by some other religious system. But like mathematics is true whether we know it's true or not, or whether we've ever been taught it or not as individuals, doesn't make the multiplication table any less true. 2 times 2 is 4, whether you've been taught it or not. 4 times 4 is 16, whether you've been taught it or not. 10 times 10 is 100, whether you've been taught it or not. And the same is true with the moral law that we observe. It's true whether or not anyone has been taught it. And we recognize that that's categorically different than someone's opinion or preference. 10 times 10 is 100 is not an opinion, it's not a preference, it's true and it's a fact. In the same way that committing murder is always wrong, and it's not an opinion, it's not subjective, it's always morally wrong, and therefore we put morality in a different category than instincts. We put it like in the category of absolute truth, like a mathematics table or multiplication table. No one would ever claim the multiplication table could be different simply because people don't like it. If for some reason you have some personal reason why you don't like 4 times 4 equals 6, or 4 times 4 is 16, your personal preference doesn't change the fact. And the fact that sexual immorality is immoral, or fornication, let's say, is sexually immoral, doesn't change the fact that it is. You have an opinion about it, but it doesn't change the fact. So the moral law is clearly not the same as some nation deciding, let's say, to which side of the road to drive on. Should we drive our cars on the right side of the road or the left side of the road? That's a preference. That's a choice. Any nation, any culture, any society can make a choice as to which side of the road cars should drive on. What they cannot do is decide whether or not the moral law can be ignored or suppressed, because that is a violation of what we know in our hearts we can't do or ought not to do. And here, in a true, philosophical or logistical approach to this. The moment we say that one moral set of standards is better than another set of moral standards, let's say Western culture versus Nazism, as C.S. Lewis was famous for saying, the moment we say our culture is better than Nazism, the moment we say that, we are acknowledging that there really is a moral standard and that this culture more closely matches the true moral standard than this culture. And again, we're saying that there actually is a moral standard, and one has more conformity to it and another does not. And so we are again testifying and recognizing the existence of a true moral standard. So the standard that measures the difference or the quality of different cultural moralities must be the real standard, the one that all cultures ought to follow, and that some are more conforming to that true standard than others are. So by way of another example of how to understand this, C.S. Lewis, who claims in his book he'd never been to New York, declares, well, New York is a real place. Okay? It has objectively objectively measurable qualities that may or may not match what happens when anyone hears the word New York or in their mind thinks of the place called New York. It has a certain number, total number of people who live in the city. It has a certain number of buildings, certain number of businesses that are located there, has, all kinds of streets and cars, and has all kinds of statistics that we can throw at it that are factual and true at any given moment. But when the word New York pops into our conscience, any one of us could have a different thought about it. Oh, that place is beautiful. Oh, that place is dirty. Oh, that place has great food. Oh, I hate the restaurants in New York. Any one of us can have these different perceptions, but it doesn't change the facts about the place called New York. In the same way, we can all have different perceptions, we can all have different emotional responses to a true moral standard, but our responses don't change the nature and the existence of that same moral standard. And another one, and this also came up as an example in the I Don't Have Enough Faith book, but in Mere Christianity, he talks about the witch trials. And let me try to explain this. It's on the previous session as well, but let me try to explain this. So in centuries past, they actually had witch trials, and they had people that they thought were witches. They actually thought that these witches may have power to bring cruelty and harm, maybe even death, to people by casting these spells on them. And so if they thought someone was a witch, they thought they were practicing witchcraft, they might have a trial and incarcerate them or maybe even kill them for being a sorceress. Okay. Now we don't have those anymore. A few hundred years later, we don't have these witch trials anymore. But did anything with morality change because we are no longer executing witches? Again, the line of argumentation here is no. If witches truly had the ability to harm, injure, or kill somebody, then it's right to deal with them judicially and even putting them to death if they had taken someone's life or clearly possessed the power and the intention to do so, maybe even to that point. But recognizing as society advances in understanding and culture, understanding that witches don't have any actual real power, therefore it would be foolish or immoral to put someone to death for pretending to have power, there's no change or advancement in the moral law. The moral law stayed the same. The moral law a few hundred years ago during those trials would have been if someone is cruel and wicked and murderous, you deal with them judicially. And in this state, we would say the same thing. If someone is cruel and murderous and has evil intentions against others, dealing with that judicially as a society is the right thing to do. The moral standard hasn't changed. It's the understanding of what the capacity for witches to engage in activities has changed. The moral standard has remained the same. So moral laws or standards, as we observe the world that we live in, only apply to man and never apply to another object or life form that has the same naturally occurring requirement. So, again, C.S. Lewis loves to give us examples. So, no one expects a rock to behave differently than what it does. Okay? Even if a specific rock is not intended or useful for the purpose which you desired for it to be, to build a rock wall or to lay a foundation of some sort or whatever its purpose was. If you wanted a rock to do something and the rock you observe or hold or whatever doesn't fit that purpose, you need a different rock to do it. The rock, you don't blame the rock for being a rock of an unhelpful purpose to you. Okay? That's the point of example, right? So rocks behave the way rocks are intended to behave. They're just rocks. In many same respects, electrons and molecules have certain properties and behaviors, but they are constrained to be what they are, not what they ought to do. So rocks can't have this ought to moral standard against what, they're doing something different than what they ought to be. Just like electrons and molecules don't have an ought to be kind of standard, they just are. These are just parts of the material universe that we live in. That seems fundamentally different than the mankind existence that we observe of ourselves. Mankind uniquely behaves differently than all other objects in the world. And we seem to know, again, back to chapter 1, that we ought to do something and then make excuses when we fail to do so. So, unwanted human behaviors are not just a matter of convenience or preference, like a rock being the right rock or an atom or a molecule being the right one that you need at a given moment in time. We have something different going on with humanity. Okay? So, again, going through examples here with C.S. Lewis. A man occupying my favorite seat on a train because he arrived before I did is inconvenient to me. A man who moved my bag that was holding my seat while my back was turned so that he could sit in my favorite seat is not just inconvenient to me. He's actually committed a moral offense against me by moving my bag so he could sit in the seat that I had claimed first. Okay. Also, so in that sense, when we compare these two scenarios, we rightly blame the second man for moving our bag to sit in our seat, and the first man is just merely an inconvenience, but he's not to be blamed for some moral transgression just because he happened to be where we wanted to be before we got there. Here's another example. I like this one even better. A person who accidentally trips me is not guilty of violating any moral law. He had no intention of harm, was not trying to trip me. Okay? And if I trip and I fall and I break a bone, well, that's a shame, but it's not immoral unless he did something against the moral standard. A person, by contrast, who tries to trip me but doesn't succeed is still guilty of a moral transgression. Compare those two scenarios. A person who trips me accidentally has committed no moral offense. A person who failed to trip me has committed a moral offense when he tried to trip me, even if he didn't succeed. There's a big difference between these two scenarios. And the thing that differentiates between the two is not the outcome, but the intent of the heart, what the person ought to have done or should not have done but tried to do. So, obeying the moral law often costs us more than not obeying it. That's another distinctive here. Recognize it's not always about the advancement of something good. It can cost us more to be moral than to let our instincts drive us into decisions that are immoral. So, not cheating on schoolwork when it would be easy to do so and get a better grade costs me something. I could get a better grade if I looked over on my neighbor's paper and got the right answer. I could get a better grade if I brought a cheat sheet in with me and I wrote down some answers from my cheat sheet on the exam. Okay? It cost me a grade or lower grade by not cheating. Not pursuing every sexual desire or impulse, no matter how strongly the urge may be, cost me something. I have this desire, and I have a desire to see that sexual release, it costs me something to say, no, I'm married, I cannot pursue that. Or I'm not married and I have no right to pursue sexual encounters before I get married. It costs me something. Okay. Keeping promises that I might prefer to break costs me something. Oh, I promised I would sell you my car for $10,000. But then the car market completely changed, and suddenly my car became far more valuable, and now it's worth $15,000. I agreed to sell it to you for 10. I could sell it to somebody else for 15. What's the right moral thing to do? Now, maybe you might reverse it and say the right moral thing for the buyer to do is to offer me the current market value of it. That's a different scenario. But if I've made an agreement, if I've signed a contract to sell my car for $10,000, and I now know I can get more for it, it's immoral for me to break my word, to break my agreement. It cost me, in this example, $5,000. Telling the truth, even when it makes me look foolish, cost me something. People will look at me as a fool when I tell them, oh, that's right, that's what I did. I forgot to put gas in my car, and I went to go to work, and I couldn't get to work, and I ran out of gas, and I was late for work. Okay, and so I start telling people, well, why did you why did you do that? Well, that seemed to me at the moment to be a very, not very helpful example, but it costs me something because it makes me look foolish. I've done something foolish, but if I tell the truth, it might be the moral thing to do rather than what keeps my reputation intact. Okay. The nature of, so the law of human nature, or right and wrong, must be something that's above and beyond the actual facts of our human behavior. So here we see, so what lies behind this moral law? There is a real moral law which man did not invent, but men know they ought to obey. Say that again. There really is, what we find as we examine all these examples and understanding of the human nature as we examine even within our own selves, there is a real moral law which man did not invent. This is not an invention of mankind. It's something that stands above and outside of the existence of humanity. But all men know they ought to obey. Where did that come from? How can all human beings know that there really is a moral standard? They know when they violated the moral standard, and they know that they ought to do something, and it compels them to make this instinct to be encouraged and causes this instinct to be suppressed because it's the right thing to do. Where does it come from? It can't come from man. It has to come from outside of man. So when we look at scientifically, well, how would we scientifically explain the existence of the moral law? We find that science can give us no answers. Okay? Science can tell us there is a universe that we live in. Science cannot tell us why there's a universe. Science can answer questions about the fact that the universe is continuing on, that certain features and functions of the universe that we see in operation today happen, but it doesn't tell us why the universe continues on or why it does in the manner that it does. Okay? If there's a why it does, it's not a scientific answer that can be given. Why is there a moral law that all humans know about? Science cannot give us that answer. We cannot investigate the why, but we can certainly see the existence of the moral law. The why has to come, the why of the existence of the moral law has to come from something outside of science, and it has to come from outside of man. So, the one thing in the universe that we have the capacity for the greatest insight into is man. We can learn a lot about rocks. We can learn a lot about the sun and the moon and the stars in the sky. We can learn a lot about atoms and DNA within our systems. But when it comes to anything else, what we have the greatest insight into is ourselves, is mankind. We are humans, and it gives us, as Lewis describes, an insider view unlike anything else we've ever seen or can observe. we can look inside ourselves, and we can't look inside of any other created thing.